Welcome to St. Mary's University of Twickenham and to the Center for the Social Scientific Study of the Bible. It's my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce to you Professor James Crossley, who joined the university and the center last September as Professor of Bible, Society, and Politics after serving at the University of Sheffield for 10 years. In 2004, James published his University of Nottingham doctoral thesis as The Dating of Mark's Gospel, Insight from the Law and Earliest Christianity with T&T Clark. In it, he argued basically that everybody in the whole world was wrong about the dating of the first written account of Jesus. And his work ever since has been marked by a willingness to challenge accepted views, to rewrite standard discourses, and to hold up a mirror to New Testament scholarship in a way that exposed what had always been there before, but somehow went unnoticed. Among his many publications are Why Christianity Happened, a socio-historical account of Christian origins, 26 to 50 CE, in 2006, which I don't think I've ever told you. It's actually my favorite book you've written. How Did Christianity Begin? A Believer and Non-Believer Examine the Evidence with Mike Bird in 2008 with Hendrickson. Jesus in an Age of Terror, 2009 with Equinox. Reading the New Testament, Contemporary Approaches in 2010 with T&T Clark. Jesus in an Age of Neoliberalism in 2013 with Equinox. Jesus in the Chaos of History in 2015 with Oxford University Press. And the book whose second edition we are celebrating tonight, Harnessing Chaos, the Bible in English Political Discourse since 1968. That was published by Bloomsbury T&T Clark originally in 2014. He has also co-edited Writing History, Constructing Religion in 2005, Jesus Beyond Nationalism in 2009, and Judaism, Jewish Identities, and Gospel Tradition in 2010. Professor Crossley also serves as the editor of the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus and frequently appears on radio, television, and podcasts. He has supervised so many PhDs that he's forgotten how many. As is clear from this list of publications, which is embarrassingly for the rest of us only a fraction of his output, Professor Crossley's scholarship dwells at the intersection of history, interpretation, theory, and especially politics, particularly as they relate to Jesus and the Bible. Although it's clearly not the case that Professor Crossley is the only New Testament scholar to pay attention to the malleability of Jesus, Christian history, and its written remains in the hands of the powers that be, he is currently conducting his research at such a level that he has very few peers in the world. I would go so far as to say that he is creating a new subdiscipline within New Testament studies that moves beyond simple reception history and focuses intently upon the impact of biblical interpretation on politics and the impact of politics on biblical interpretation. The text and the state, Professor Crossley is showing us, are more related than we might imagine and have been for some time. James Crossley got to this field before the rest of us, and anyone else who has anything at all to say about it will necessarily be riding his coattails, answering his questions. For all these reasons, it's a tremendous honor that Professor Crossley has joined our Theology and Biblical Studies team here at St. Mary's. His research and character exemplify what St. Mary's strives to be as a Catholic research university. His concerns for social justice, the poor, the disenfranchised, all themes that run throughout his publications, are thoroughly at home in and have a long history among Catholic theologians and thinkers. When I first came to St. Mary's in 2012, I introduced myself to James at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting that year. We had several mutual friends, but we'd never been properly introduced. He welcomed me to the UK New Testament scene and told me that if there was anything he could ever do to help me at St. Mary's, to let me know, or to let him know. Indeed, I did have an idea about how he could help me at St. Mary's. And it took a few years, but here we are. Professor Crossley, I officially welcome you to St. Mary's University, the Center for the Social Scientific Study of the Bible, and to this podium tonight.
Very sweet. The thing is, Chris is like kind of the most professional person I know, but I also know him behind the scenes. He's not really like that at all. But I'm really very happy to be part of the centre. I mean, it's really a fantastic centre, and Chris is, Steve has mentioned this, well, Chris is really made this the best place, I think, certainly in the UK, to be working in biblical studies right now. But this is all about me. Chris said to speak for an hour. Now, I'm not going to do that because it's crazy. I'm going to speak, I'll take a bit shorter than that to talk about the book. It's a book launch, singular launch. I guess Bloomsbury people don't mind if I pass it around, as long as you don't damage it, spit in it, drop wine. And I'm really going to summarise. Sorry, I don't want to eat blocks. Summarise what the book's about, so you don't have to buy it. Okay, it's really, in a nutshell, it's about what the Bible really means since 1968. What people forget all the kind of clever stuff some of you may have done about. You know what the Book of Acts and Steve Cates, Paul and Ward's case, or whatever, Gospels in Chris's case. You can do all the clever stuff. It's kind of meaningless when it comes to modern politics. What politicians think the Bible means is something really quite different. And this changes over time, as you can imagine, but over the past 40 or so years, there's been some very significant changes in the public understanding of the Bible in political discourse. Some very significant changes. And it's quite interesting actually talking to politicians about this, as I have from time to time. When I first started doing this, I thought that, this is just a cynical way of trying to drum up support or whatever. By and large, with some exceptions, I think politicians really, really mean what they say when they talk about the Bible and religion. Okay, why the Bible and politics? This is not necessarily what you would call a country that has a Christian vote in the sense that America does. You're not going to swing an election necessarily by touting a Christian vote. You don't want to lose a Christian vote, on the other hand. There's no point offending potential voters or anything like this. The Bible is, if you like, physically present in Parliament. You can find verses here and there in House of Commons and so on. Sitting there, it's consistently used by, as far back as, probably forever, by any Prime Minister. The Bible will always be cited by a Prime Minister. Whenever you see a kind of newspaper headline saying, David Cameron or Gordon Brown was the first Prime Minister to cite the Bible since the 19th century, it's just a lie, or it's misunderstood. It's always been cited by every Prime Minister I've been of. It consistently functions as an implicit authority for any political decision, but ultimately really for British or English democracy. It's the foundation of English democracy in the hands of politicians. It's also very commonly used, and this was a bit of a surprise to me, among many protest groups outside Parliament. This is very easy to find, and we'll come to this in due course. Political parties and their heritage, the old cliche about the Conservatives was it was the Anglican Church was the Tory party of prayer, not so much these days. Labour Party had strong non-conformist background, so did the Liberal Party, the old Liberal Party. So it's a very significant part in the formation of political parties. And there are various small reasons here and there. You can, if done right, get a good press out of it. It wasn't so easy for Tony Blair to get a good press using the Bible and religion. Gordon Brown did okay out of it though. David Cameron used to do okay until the press started realising he was repeating himself almost word for word every year. And there are certain lobbyist groups which have some effect. Again, you don't want to offend them. Now, whenever I work on this, I won't go into it too much here, but I think always when I'm talking about the Bible or religion, or when anyone's really talking about the Bible or religion, we're thinking about kind of longer term social, economic and political contexts which are dictating or embedded in or interacting with the way the Bible is understood. My focus was particularly from the rise of Thatcher, not just as leader, but just prior to becoming leader in the early 70s, through to Cameron and the near victory, possible victory, of Thatcher's understanding of the Bible to come to. But this also was at the time when, of a period of key shifts in economics, from Keynesianism to neoliberalism. In other words, from when there was a strong emphasis on welfare and state intervention to a time when this has been, at least rhetorically, downplayed and issues of individualism and private sector have been emphasised particularly strongly. It's also a period which has seen the impact of 1968. By 1968, it's more of a shorthand for the social upheavals, political upheavals and cultural upheavals of the 1960s and the student rebellions of 1968. Now, 68 gets a lot of press for the left. This was the big revolutionary moment for the left. But it is at least as significant for the political right, certainly in the UK, certainly in the States, I think. It's possibly deliberately, and I think in certain cases this is the case, the group around Thatcher deliberately used the language of freedom and individualism that came from the left and reapplied it. Economic liberalism. You've got the freedom to choose your school, hospital, council house, and so on. So 1968 and the 60s was just as important for the right, if not more important. There are, of course, a number of social changes since the 1960s. I put social liberalism here, kind of shifting attitudes towards things like homosexuality, shifting attitudes about gender, but also reactions against them. The 60s is often portrayed as this kind of liberal hippie kind of decade, which is not entirely accurate at all. It's also a decade which had a lot of nostalgia and reactions against it. There was programs several years ago about presumably in 2008, about the impact of 1968. And it had kind of Marxist figures like Terry Eagleton talking fondly about it. And then they asked them at the end what was the kind of biggest selling single of the year. Oh, it's the Rolling Stones. It was like Engelbert Humperdinck. So pop culturally, a lot of this stuff was quite conservative in many ways. Also since the 60s though, we've seen, and this is a very important part for how the Bible is understood as all of this is you get shifting patterns of church attendance. This, certainly in Anglican Church, is going down quite sharply. And changing patterns of belief. This didn't lead to anything like widespread atheism or the like. It led to different ways of affiliating with the church. So often you get people who will claim to be religious but won't be attending church at all. So there's not been a huge rise in the nation of atheists. It's been different ways of identifying as religious. Callum Brown, historian of modern Christianity, I think goes a little over the top, but essentially right. I don't think it has been the death of Christian British culture at all. I think it's just shifted. He said the death of Christian British culture, or the rupture in Christianity, which I think is better term, was real, and I would argue a cataclysmic event in the 1960s. And he is contextualising that in the history of Christianity in Britain, full stop. And also the significant political changes that are happening in the 70s. And really here, the crises in the Labour Party and the Tory Party, and how Thatcher seized power, effectively a kind of Thatcherite coup, but using the Bible quite explicitly, turned to the Bible. I mean, she was referring to it herself, implying that she was a modern-day apostle, a modern-day prophet, in the political sense, but with reference to biblical things. Now, there are a number of cliches about what the Bible is in British politics, English politics and culture, but actually more broadly, certainly in American politics as well. You can probably find this in different European contexts. One is a term I borrowed from Jonathan Sheehan, the cultural Bible, and by this he means a number of ways of understanding the Bible that came out of the Enlightenment. Biblical scholarship, for instance, the idea that this is a cultural resource, a historical resource, not necessarily a religious resource as such. But one aspect that he doesn't pick up on too much, which I do, is the idea of the Bible as heritage here. This is the Bible like Shakespeare, or something like this. This is part of English heritage, like a nice church or whatever. The liberal Bible is something I've developed from Yvonne Sherwood, who I still think one of the most important articles on the reception of the Bible. And this is the idea that the Bible is understood as the foundation of liberal parliamentary democracy. She argued that this is developing from the 17th century onwards. This is the ultimate cliche in English politics. The Bible is about law, tolerance, freedom, rights, monarchy sometimes, parliamentary democracy, and so on. Jesus often gets singled out here. Jesus was a liberal, nice guy. And you find this interesting among kind of the new atheists at the moment. The one person they rescue is Jesus. It was the nasty kind of church or gospel interpreters or whatever who put him in his place. And the neoliberal Bible, I'll go on to this, but really I mean the Bible is Thatcherism, and that's the crucial thing Thatcher does. But also, there's with the rise of all this, there's an interesting shift, I think, in the ways that the Bible's understood in terms of an instant image. You know the meaning of the Bible by looking at it. And I've got some kind of weird examples of this, but I'm going to go beyond British culture here. You know by market, this is the NIV Bible, the New International Version Bible. They're all exactly the same Bible, published by exactly the same publisher. Anyone want to guess? Zondervan but marketed, so you know what this Bible really means in a certain context. So this is the kind of revolution Bible for boys, teen boys. Chevron action flash, that's another part of the reference. But this is manly, tough, and it's got little things about skateboarding and bikes. This is the teen Bible for girls, exactly the same Bible course where you and your best friend can have a picture of yourself and where to complain if your teacher teaches evolution and things like this. This is particularly like this one. Same Bible, remember, the engaged couples Bible, but when you get married, you can go and buy exactly the same Bible but have the couples Bible. The stock car Bible. But each is packaged. You know what the Bible, you don't need to read it or anything like this, you know what it means. And you get all sorts of weird and wonderful examples of this. The Soldier's Bible, 2004, there's a couple of these. Again, it's Department of the Army, United States of America. You don't need to read it, you know. Or if you do, you've already got a guide to tell you its meaning. This one, does anyone want to guess on that one? What's that Bible called?
Okay.
No. It's the Queen James Version. This Bible, you know, is pro-homosexuality. Anything in the Bible, you know, the Leviticus passages, they're about prostitution or something like temple prostitution. It tells you this, but the packaging already gives you the clue. To bring it back to English politics, this is, I'm going to call it the Gove Bible. This is when Michael Gove, then Secretary of State for Education, sent King James Bible to every school. Okay. Now, the newspapers were full of kind of teachers saying, no one's going to read this. You know, we've got Bibles already and so on. But that kind of misses the point. You're not going to read it. Of course, your child's going to read it. All you need to know is that this is the Bible, as Gove called it. Has had a profound impact on our culture. Every school pupil should have the opportunity to learn about this book and the impact it's had on our history, language, literature, and democracy. Not a word about religion, interesting. This was in the celebrations of the King James Version, religion was edited out of all of it. It was all about culture, democracy, history, literature. Okay, I'm just going to skip through some of the people discussed in the book, and I look at two different strands of what come out of 1968 or associated with 1968. One is what happens to Marxism and Marxist interpretations of the Bible. I look at Christopher Hill as one example, and Christopher Hill was a famous historian of the 17th century, a committed Marxist, a committed Stalinist in his early career. Until he found out what Stalin was really up to. And then when 1968 happens and all the kind of student uprisings, he kind of simultaneously feels he has to support it, but he's very serious Marxist. So he can't support it. So he's struggling to come to terms with this. And what he does, he turns to this kind of popular revolution from below in the 17th century, the Diggers, the Levellers, Winstanley, and all these kinds of figures. In that book, not almost every paragraph, but a great percentage of the paragraphs are justifying what they're doing with reference to the Bible. Hill himself was a nonconformist, and he said shifting to the Communist Party was the only difference was God. They were exactly the same thing, nonconformity and communism. And throughout this, he's picked. This is a very common tradition on the left. He says this is really the key moment for the radical Bible. The Bible as about socialism, effectively. He says this is the Bible of collective interpretation, it's egalitarian, democratic, anti-establishment, English, revolutionary, but in contrast to any kind of anarchists and things like this in 1968, this is serious. And always the Bible is the justification for this. It's revolutionary, but very, very serious. But as his career, I mean, there's a lot of optimism when he publishes The World Upside Down, but throughout his career, as it develops, he keeps using the Bible to explain where everything goes wrong. In one level, Hill is really reading 20th century history when he reads 17th century history. And he keeps worrying about where have all the prophets gone, he asks. And then he said, the authorized version wins over the Geneva Bible. This is the establishment Bible running in the radical Bible into the ground. And this parallels what's happening with this radical Bible tradition. It is being pushed outside Parliament over the past 40 years. The tradition, I mentioned it briefly here, associated with people like Tony Benn. Tony Benn, when he published his work on socialism in the 1970s, it sold 70,000 copies, and half the book is about the Bible as the origins of English socialism. But by the time we get to the 90s and the emergence of New Labour, this is pushed away. Socialism now is trying to embrace Thatcherism. That whole radical tradition is being pushed outside parliamentary discourse. From the right, Enoch Powell is an interesting figure here. And here is someone who really picks up on the nostalgia and the conservative tendencies from the 1960s. And some of you will know his infamous speech about rivers of blood. Very anti-immigration, and some. It's trying to be reclaimed, but some of it is really outright racist at times. And what he did was try to use the Bible, use the church as a way of constructing a post-imperial nation where Parliament, but the church in second place, were important for English identity now. And when I say that the Bible and the church are subservient, what he would say was, let the politicians talk about economics. The Bible has nothing to say on this. So when it's got a passage about, say, the rich man not being able to enter the kingdom of God, or it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, he says that's nothing to do with economics. It's just about people relying on merit and trying to earn their salvation. It's got nothing to do with money, really. So any of those kind of economic passages in the Gospels, and there are, you might argue there are quite a lot, he said absolutely nothing to do with this. They're just polemics against the Jewish church. And he argued against most biblical scholars that Matthew was the first gospel. It was a gospel of consensus. It brought together two different wings, a kind of radical Gentile and a radical Jewish wing together. It was a gospel in Rome. Man was obsessed with the Roman Empire. It was a gospel fit for empire. It brought everybody together. It was a Bible or a gospel of social cohesion. Interestingly, he argued, as he loved the Romans, that the Romans were not responsible for the death of Jesus. He wasn't crucified, he was stoned to death by Jews. But he said, in the interests of social harmony, they allowed a bit of Roman blame to bring together two different wings of the church. Now, Powell, like Hill, his vision in many ways failed, yet in many ways his protege was Margaret Thatcher, who did pick up on the nostalgia and the history and so on, but in many ways she used this to change and transform both the Tory party and build upon what was happening in English culture. She was born a Methodist, brought up a Methodist, and like most Tories at the time, at least pretended to be an Anglican, converted to Anglicanism, at least gave some kind of support. But when all this stuff was happening in the 70s, she rediscovered her Methodism. And she used it to try to take on the Tory party and to take on the Labour Party and to take on the Soviet Union. Her Bible was about individualism. It was about the importance of the individual, and she sharply and regularly contrasted it with socialism, in terms of the Labour Party, Marxism generally, and of course the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Marxism and socialism destroy the individual, she argued, but the New Testament, on the other hand, well, the exact opposite. And every time she tries to make a new decision about economics or something, she will say that this is grounded in ancient biblical stuff. This is a part of our heritage. I'm just going back to the way it was. But the key thing she does is to emphasise charitable giving over welfare. There is a sustained attack on the welfare state, when it comes to issues of helping poor people and so on. Charity will do this, she said. Just like in Grantham with her father, it was, we'll look after the poor, they'll be fine if rich people will create wealth, and that will look after the poor. I think she genuinely believed this, and Frank Field said towards the end of her life, she said to him that this was her biggest regret. She created this kind of yuppie culture, and charitable giving didn't seem to rise whatsoever, and she said she really thought that was going to happen, and this was the biggest regret of her career. Now, Thatcher's one thing, but I think the important thing is that we get kind of cultural Thatcherism coming through, and subcultural credibility, even if a number of these people don't know that they are buying into a lot of Thatcherism. There's a chapter on, amongst other things, Life of Brian, which in many ways the Monty Python team are against Thatcher and Thatcherism, but in other ways they buy into it perfectly. The whole thing is a send-up of trade unions, for instance. The big line, the big payoff line, is we're all individuals, you're all individuals. Brian is effectively code for Jesus here. Unfortunately or fortunately, John Major and Gordon Brown don't play a big part in this book, because I don't think they're that significant. So they don't do anything serious in terms of what the Bible means. They kind of accept Thatcher's Bible. But the Tory version of it in the 90s really takes a hit with the whole sleaze allegations and so on. And I look at Jeffrey Archer to illuminate this at this point. And Jeffrey Archer, it was using the Bible quite a bit, but it culminated in the Gospel according to Judas by Benjamin Iscariot. And I know we're not meant to read things woodenly, we're not meant to talk about authority, intention and all this, but if ever there was a case of somebody pretending he was Judas here who was misunderstood, it's Jeffrey Archer. He said Judas was, people said he was messing around with money. He wasn't, he was just trying to help Jesus all along. And some of it you could just replace Judas with Archer. It's that obvious. Or the women who supported me. The women who supported me, he lists them, and it's parallel in this Gospel according to Judas with Mary Magdalene and things. I mean, it's some of the wording between his own life and the life of Judas is very obvious at times. Poor man, Francis Maloney was involved in this, and outside the UK, Jeffrey Archer isn't so well known. Inside the UK, he is. The poor man gets an interview and he says, well, I'm sure he's a bit of a villain. I'm sure he's done some bad things in his time. Who hasn't? This is Jeffrey Archer. And so, you know, he helps. Does anyone know who did the audiobook? Who read the audiobook? Desmond Tutu. Really? Now, the other key figure in all of this is Tony Blair. Now, Tony Blair accepts the kind of Thatcher Bible. The Bible's really about charitable giving. Okay? It's all about... Thatcher was quite explicit. She would say things like, Jesus chose to be crucified just like you can choose hospitals and so on. Blair would never go that far. But he would accept the idea that charitable giving is crucial. He would downplay the importance of welfare in his understanding of the Bible. But it's really the war on terror that framed a lot of how Blair understood the Bible. There is this cliche, the Alistair Campbell thing, who infamously said, we don't do God. Alistair Campbell's problem, in a way, is that Alistair Campbell is a kind of dedicated secularist or atheist who knows nothing about the Bible. So Tony Blair said, you know, you put a red pen whenever he saw anything religiously or biblical or anything like this, but he just didn't pick up on half of it. Tony Blair got this through no problem, because Alistair Campbell just didn't see it. And so there's quite a lot in Tony Blair about the Bible. And the crucial moment, I think, was his speech after September 11th to the Labour Party conference. And he is deliberately picking up on the old radical tradition, the old radical Bible tradition in the Labour movement. And for those of you who may know this, the Beveridge report in the 1945 Labour government used all this apocalyptic language, which was quite standard on the left at the time, about bringing a new Jerusalem. And the NHS and the development of the welfare state is going to transform the country in this kind of apocalyptic manner. It will bring something new and wonderful and so on. Blair used almost the exact language, which wasn't picked up by the press, but it would have been picked up in the conference, to justify the invasion of Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq. We will be bringing, he would use the word New Jerusalem in this context, but we will be bringing we'll be transforming these countries into something like what we know. He also does exactly the same thing with the Quran, interestingly. You get hints of this with Thatcher, but Blair brings the Quran into all this and says the same kinds of things, but it's important. He keeps saying the Quran is all about liberal democracy at heart, just like the Bible. Remember this, I know these things were written several centuries before. And the construction of true Islam and false Islam. Again, Thatcher does this a little, but Blair really goes for it. True Islam, true religion, is about freedom, democracy and rights. False Islam, Al-Qaeda, that's not real Islam. The key thing in terms of the other key thing in terms of the Bible, he pushes that radical Bible outside Parliament. And what he really does is add, where Thatcher had a kind of economically liberal Bible, he has a socially liberal Bible. So the Bible now supports things like gay rights, gender equality, and things like this. You don't get that much of that with Thatcher. And whenever there's anything potentially illiberal in the Bible, he would just, Obama does this as well, he would say, well, Sermon on the Mount. That would support these kinds of things. It's interesting that he's conversion to Catholicism because he went against pretty much every major line that the Pope took on Iraq, on birth control and things like this. He quite explicitly, and he said, well, it's the young people whose interpretation really matters. They're the ones who are going to transform. Theirs is the real. I mean, he goes very close to using the children. He does use the children as the future. And his influence in Parliament has been very significant. In the same-sex marriage debate, whenever the Bible was cited, it was cited in favour of gay marriage. Now, you probably couldn't imagine that in the States, for instance, but in the UK, it was cited emphatically in favour. And that's been accepted by Cameron, Gove, all the mainstream Tories. And the era of the coalition and the post-recession era of Cameron-led governments at first was more of the same. The Liberal Democrats Do God is worth reading, if only for entertainment value. Again, just buys into Thatcher's Bible whilst pretending not to be Thatcherite. Again, you'll find people saying Jesus chose to be crucified, therefore this is like liberalism. And what can't really be done in mainstream political or front bench political discourse could be done on the fringes of the Lib Dems. And there is one particularly odd article, which is effectively the liberal Holy Spirit. The Bible is terrible, one guy said. Paul is awful, but luckily we have the Holy Spirit to guide us and tell us that everything is liberal and decent. David Cameron sort of started slowly with all this. I mean, I'll give you one big quote there, which is very typical. The Bible is, well, it's the foundation of everything that he likes. But there's this one throwaway line, the first forms of welfare provision, i.e. not the state. And that comes up again and again with Cameron. It develops, we'll see shortly. But the other thing that is happening throughout from the 90s onwards is direct action groups are taking up the Bible quite a lot. There's the Ploughshares movement, which comes from some of the radical Catholics in the States, but comes into the UK and is behind the dismantling of the jet near Preston that was going to bomb East Timor in the 90s. That was using the language of Isaiah. Occupy. The Bible keeps turning up in Occupy all the time. Jesus in the temple is very, very easy to find. Terry Eagleton was writing The Guardian as well this time, cites Jesus in the temple as crucial. This is the anti-austerity, anti-capitalist kind of Bible, alive and well in the Occupy movement. And you find it in the controversy of the Patois Bible, and it turns up in the riots as well. People, the language of Babylon, very long history. Babylon is the Tory government. So it's there, it's outside Parliament, and still Thatcher's Bible remains the dominant Bible with a Blairite qualification. So that's what they kind of bookended really. And then since 2014, this is the second edition of it, the revised edition of it, a number of crucial things happened. Cameron was increasingly explicit about what the Bible meant in light of a number of controversies. Who was the real founder of Big Society? Jesus. He said this explicitly. Jesus founded big society. And of course, this is building on what Thatcher did. It's downplaying welfare and promoting kind of charitable giving. It put some of the churches in a real bind, because of course churches are going to get involved in charitable giving, but a number of churches were quite heavily involved in things like the welfare state. Cameron's not stupid here in some ways. He's deliberately trying to provoke and get church support on this. Now, when he came into criticism, under criticism for what happened with the floods a couple of years ago and the food banks, he turned to the Bible again. This is what Jesus would have done. So vicars canoeing people out of flooded homes, well, it's the Bible. It's a good thing, isn't it? Food banks, we should be helping the poor, is his argument. Sure, they've risen, but that's a good thing, according to this logic, just like Jesus. And then Cameron begins using the Good Samaritan a lot when talking about ISIS, of all things. We cannot walk by on the other side. He builds on this language of true and false Islam. And whenever we get an event like Woolwich or whatever ISIS do in the Middle East, this is false Islam. He does not want, it's nothing to do with British foreign policy. In fact, it's bad Islam. And then we cannot walk by on the other side. The Bible becomes an authority for what we may or may not do in the Middle East. Finally, but the most interesting thing for me, and this was kind of predictable in many ways, was that this radical tradition kept creeping back towards Parliament. And that's not typical. The Miliband thing is when Ed Miliband brings in Russell Brand. And Russell Brand had his political moment a couple of years ago and brings in the Bible all the time. Interestingly, though, the reception of him in the press barely mentions that he brings in the Bible and Jesus and Christianity, and instead attacks him for things Hare Krishna, Hinduism, Transcendentalism, anything kind of hippie sounding. And the problem for this was Brand doesn't have that kind of political credibility. It was deemed non-English in some kinds of ways, but nobody really touched his interpretation of the Bible. And I think that's because the Bible, the press, and we did a study of this, me and a journalism professor at Sheffield, the press don't quite know what to do with religion in the Bible, but they were very reluctant to be critical of it, apart from a few voices like the Dawkins and so on. But when it really came back to the fore in mainstream politics was the leadership contest, Labour leadership contest, and Jeremy Corbyn, who identifies as sort of, I guess, not quite a believer, but he's always talking about his respect for the Bible almost instantly, and I think this is deliberate. It's the one thing that can give him some protection here. It's the one tradition that has kind of respect in English political discourse on the left, that kind of radical Christianity. And he's been using this speech after speech. He's been described in terms of a radical Christian of the old Tony Benn variety and so on. And it's about one of the few things that's really worked for him in terms of the media reception. And he starts using the Good Samaritan, and here he's got Margaret Thatcher in mind, I suspect, as well as David Cameron, to defend welfare. So we do not walk by on the other side means we will provide welfare provision for the poorest. That's not walking down the other side. He also cites the Good Samaritan in the Bible when he has the controversy over not singing the national anthem and things like this at the War Memorial. He turns to the Bible because this is deemed an English thing. And again, the Good Samaritan. He also uses true and false Islam. But false Islam, he has the same assumptions as Cameron and the rest. But false Islam, the Al-Qaedas and all this, means we don't talk to them. We don't negotiate with them. We work out other means, non-violent means preferably, of dealing with this problem. And a number of figures now have come out saying things that were, I think, unthinkable 5 years ago in English parliamentary politics. Cat Smith, I kind of have a sentimental attachment to Cat Smith. She's from Barringford, where I'm from. We had the same sixth form teacher. She did religious studies. And she's the MP now for Lancaster and Fleetwood. And she is saying absolutely openly Jesus was a socialist. Which anathema, I think, to the whole New Labour project. And again, bringing in all sorts of examples from Occupy. And this Corbyn movement has been particularly interesting to me because all that has come back into parliamentary discourse since the recession. I was wondering if nothing would ever change, but it really seems quite significant at the moment. And its future really is dependent on what happens to Corbyn. Now, if that stays in Parliament, it means it will be because the Corbyn movement has had some influence. If the Corbyn movement fails, I suspect empty goes again and we'll get this intensified version of Thatcher's Parliament campaign. This picture, by the way, is KMR, a satirical artist. He says he's an ardent socialist, but he keeps mocking Jeremy Corbyn wherever he can. And you can't see it here, but it's on the front cover of the book. He's got the hammer and sickle on Corbyn's forehead, and the mother is the Labour Party. And he called it St Jeremy, is the picture. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I probably told way longer than I should have.
Crossley's agreed to take some questions, so if you have any, shoot.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And this may be in the book, it's just a question really. You're very sharp on analysis and description. But is there a place in your discourse for a really critical evaluation in terms of saying some of these positions are false?
Yeah, it's very difficult. Because in one sense they're all false. If we did it by the old historical critical thing, if somebody, Chris and Steve, were going to read the gospel text, we'd probably come to the conclusion that a lot of this is false. I still think, if I was going to make a judgment, this is my biases coming in, but I still think this is right. I think it's I don't think it's that controversial to say that some of that old radical tradition is not without foundation in biblical texts. You can't really read some of the gospel texts and some of the prophetic stuff without thinking that they are tapping into something quite significant here. Sure, the ancient world has got all sorts of differences to us, but they figures such as Jesus, Waldegrave and St. Paul, I think he's probably right here, are engaging with big concepts of empire, big concepts of social injustice, and they will tell you something about that in an ancient context that's pretty crucial, at least in terms of a lineage to the present. So if I was going to be pushed, and one says I want to keep this as a modern history, but if I was going to be pushed, I would say that is something that can be, not reclaimed, maybe the wrong word, but certainly is certainly present, and that I would personally happily work with, and I think it's an important tradition, and it's always there, and I think its key function is it's at least got some ground. You can't really ignore all that material in the gospel tradition and the prophetic tradition without thinking, it just can't be skimmed over.
Thanks, that's right. Thank you.
I wondered if I've got a comment. If my memory serves, Hilary Benn uses the parable of the Good Samaritan in his speech on bombing.
Yes.
And it's just deeply ironic that he's doing that compared to his father. And I wondered if you thought about that at all.
There's a number of things going on in that one. Unfortunately, I'd already submitted the additional chapter when Hilary Benn had come up with this, but it's the Good Samaritan seems to be the kind of flashpoint at the moment. Cameron's using it regularly, typically with reference to the Middle East. Corbyn's using it to defend his position on X, Y, and Z, and Hilary Benn very explicitly, very, very explicitly uses the Good Samaritan. Now, his father wouldn't have done that, certainly. His father wouldn't have said, walk on by does not mean bombing someone. That's pretty clear. He does, this isn't a defence of Hilary Benn because I don't agree with him at all on this, but the way he framed this was to talk about fascism. Fascism is the great evil here that we have to deal with. And he's trying to reclaim that kind of interventionist foreign policy that you can get with the Labour left from World War II. So, Tony Benn did continue to think, World War II was the right thing to do. And I think Hilary Benn is trying to tap into that tradition. His father would have disagreed, sure. But there is that sort of anti-fascism thing there as the kind of other that he does. So it's not quite as far removed from his father, but there's no way his father would have made that speech.
Thanks, James, for the book and the presentation. Every time I listen to you or read your book, I'm really struck by the way in which I think it's going to become a really significant piece of a larger puzzle. If one of the things we're seeing in other disciplines is, for example, this fascinating turn to political theology as a way of reconceptualizing, especially philosophy. And there's so much going now on an international level in terms of this stuff. And you get people like Kent de Vries, being increasingly trenchant about the way in which the secular is, in some ways, a weird kind of a detour, actually, or it thought it was a detour, but it really wasn't. It was a kind of blip on the screen. And what he means when he says that stuff now is I think just that we've been under the illusion of kind of our own ignorance about so many of the older traditions and how they really didn't even stop very much. They just kind of they're running right through our contemporary moment. And there's so much of this going on in philosophy, and every time I listen to you or read your stuff, I think that in some ways, they're turning to the distant past and making people think, oh, we need to rethink Trinitarian controversies and all this stuff that people in philosophy say hadn't really thought was that important for a long time. And you're kind of the contemporary arm of this transformation, I think, at least as seminary focuses. And one of the things, though, more specifically, I wanted to ask about was this question in 1968. And as you know, I've been really interested in what happens in France, in the sense that massive intellectual fervor is happening around the question of whether the revolutionaries of 68 or would-be revolutionaries of 68 are able to present themselves, say, as a new Paul. And there's a lot of it going, and I think essential kind of theoretical debates, say in Paris, are happening by way of a recapitulation of these biblical motifs. Is something similar happening in the UK? And if not, why not?
I think it is. I mean, take Eagleton, for instance, who you say is overlapping quite significantly. He was in Paris in 68 and so on, but also kind of engaging with Badiou and Zizek and so on and so forth. Comes out of a kind of radical Catholic tradition of the 1960s, quite explicitly, and rereading kind of English literature, but also the Bible. I mean, and Eagleton's reading of Jesus is just kind of a straightforward liberation theology style reading. I mean, not categorized as Irish or something, I suppose, but I mean, it's coming out of an English tradition there. You find it more in the UK, not so much at the kind of academic level that I think you work with. I think you find it, and I think this says something about kind of English politics at the kind of more direct action level, where a lot of that stuff, that's where it really, aside from churches, where obviously this stuff does keep simmering away, you get it in various groups. I mentioned the Ploughshares and things like this. It's there, it's always there. It's just pushed out of the left of the Labour Party and things like this. It's pushed out of, I think philosophy in the UK is heavily secularised at some moment. I think it's problematic in many, many ways. It's really called for liberalism in many, many senses. But its re-entry under Corbyn to the prominence really comes from something that's been happening outside Parliament for many, many years. And I think it was in a number of these disparate kind of groups. Now, you could say what's specifically English or British about that. You could probably make some arguments because it's always been associated with radical groups doing things with the land, for instance, and that kind of protest. But the continental example is different, I think. It's happening in universities. Badiou is open in the 80s, isn't he? Now, I can't imagine that happening in philosophy department here in the 1990s in the city, not with that kind of impact. So I think there is probably something, as it would be in France and elsewhere, something quite distinctive about kind of English radical tradition that's kind of a degree of practical, pragmatic, direct action, not necessarily sort of high philosophy, but I think kind of just important in its own way.
Jim, I'm conscious you have some students here, and so I wonder if you'd answer a more kind of personal question on how do you get from learning Greek paradigms and Aramaic paradigms to this in your own career? At what point, and what they won't know, but some of us do, is there are many people in biblical studies who look at this and say that's not really New Testament studies, right? So at what point in your career did this kind of kick in that this needs to be done? Like, how did you get from very traditional type studies to I want to do this type of thing.
It's very difficult to answer that because I don't know why I do things. I know when we should always just, if there's an interview, I should say, well, I did all this, I made this decision in 2004. Really, you kind of do these things because you enjoy them or whatever. But I don't think there's a sharp contrast necessarily between them. I always think what I did when I do the ancient world, when I look at Jesus, Christian origins, or even something like the law in Mark, and kind of trying to understand the kind of social circumstances that lead people to engage with the world as they do. And I'm particularly interested in why social change, how that develops new ideas and how it can either lead to kind of a new power taking over, but the kind of radical potentials that are in this. And I see this in Christian origins. And I think when we talk about Christian origins, I don't see a sharp contrast with talking about the world today. So if I'm talking about Christian origins, I think stuff that's happening in Galilee, there's these social upheavals in Galilee, some very significant social upheavals in Galilee so as Jesus is growing up, let's just say that. Building of two very, very significant towns, which changes things. And I see the kind of whole Jesus movement as a reaction, interaction with that, and a way of developing new ideas, new ways of thinking about the world, new ways of dealing with justice, injustice, and so on, and new ways of co-opting power. I think that kind of methodologically, I think that's exactly what's happening now. We see that the 60s was crucial. It threw up all sorts of ideas. It gave up kind of radical ideas. It gave up new ways of co-opting theology and religion in terms of power as well. So I'm kind of interested in social change, and I think methodologically it's very similar. The allegation that this stuff isn't proper biblical studies is common. It just depends on what you want biblical studies to be. I happen to like the idea of a kind of big, coherent, still coherent, but big model of it's about the origins, developments of biblical texts, but how it's used up until the present, and I think they're always interacting with one another. Some of it's just pragmatic. I mean, the big societies do reception history, and that's just the way it is, whether you like it or not.
To what extent do you think that accusation is founded in individual scholars actually thinking that they kind of rise above these, they're geniuses, right? We all, in academics, we all think we're geniuses, but, that might be a social current, but I'm in control of myself.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of notion that that's not really biblical, that, because I couldn't be a part of that. Where you can't read your work on this stuff and not think, well, it's ridiculous to think that we can extricate ourselves from all of these.
Yeah, I don't buy that at all, as you can probably guess. There's no way that individuals can just abstract themselves and think we can just read this biblical text purely. We see it all the time. I've seen it in my own work. I would say things on phrases that I've hammered since are like very Jewish. It's a kind of meaningless term in many ways. I find myself using this in stuff 2003, 2004. I didn't mean it to come across as a kind of silly way of understanding Judaism, but I was doing it. My intentions were certainly not dishonourable, but I'm using this kind of language without knowing. And your stuff will probably be terribly racist in 20 years' time. But you're not being it right now, are you?
I can blame it on
you. You just say but you see this in some of the gender stuff. I mean, I reckon some of this seemingly harmless stuff we were publishing 10, 15 years or saying at conferences, you wouldn't get away with now. And we all are more acutely aware of this now, and it's a good thing. But these things change and you can't. The other thing is I wouldn't want to disassociate kind of political engagement or whatever engagement from what you're doing. I don't think it's necessarily bad that somebody happens to be an evangelical Christian and then goes and reads the text, because that, sure, it can distort things, we know that, but it can also ask questions that some of us might not ask. And I think the political thing too, if I want to know what the kind of social circumstances were, why people talk about justice and injustice in that way, well, that's clearly coming from a committed position, but you can make historical judgments that way as well. I kind of embrace it a lot more.
I was going to ask that actually. Part of what I think is so good about this, and I wonder if you've seen it, I don't want to describe it just as a meta-narrative, because it's not, but it's power to be able to, for all of us within biblical studies, to read your book alongside biblical scholarship that's come out since 1968, and actually to create a dialogue within that, the idea that any commentary is not absorbed within this. If,
Yeah.
if we read it as objective, we'd be ridiculous. So I think there's a lot in this. I need to set it as a parallel text alongside anybody. Read a chapter from your book and feed it in. So I just wonder whether you.
It's an interesting point. I guess some of my earlier stuff was like that, reading biblical scholarship over the past 40 years. But in one sense, all these boundaries are kind of artificial. I mean, my focus was largely on what we would call English political discourse, right? So politicians, kind of political activists, and so on. But in one sense, it's an artificial boundary in biblical scholarship, because this is a part of the product of things that have been happening over the past 40 years. I think the example I gave of Jewishness, there's been a shift in, this affects British politics quite a lot, of kind of an indifference towards Israel and Judaism prior to 1967, the Six Day War, to a dramatic cultural shift after 1967. Almost paralleling this is the New Testament scholars very negative about Judaism, suddenly with this positive rhetoric about Judaism. Now that, I think, is fairly obviously explicable in terms of contemporary politics. Issues of individualism and things, these start happening quite a lot during the Cold War in biblical scholarship. And you can multiply these examples. Former colleague of yours, Marty, pointed out that a number of people reading Deuteronomy are talking about this as a foundational proto-democratic text of the ancient Near East. Interestingly, over the past 30 to 40 years, and we did this independently. So I said, this is kind of, you could get this language from Margaret Thatcher or something like that. In one sense, that boundary is artificial, and I guess by turning to things like Life of Brian or pop music or whatever, you can see that these trends are working all over the place, and biblical scholarship is not somehow above all that at all. It could be.
Okay, I have a question. Then we talked about Jan Korwin-Mikke. He's a very radical Polish politician.
Oh, yeah.
You know that he's, this man of controversy. He has he had 3 wives and 8 illegitimate children. 3 wives, but separate.
Oh, right.
At different points.
Yeah.
And he has
Poland's
8
changed
children. 8 children. All are illegitimate according to Catholic law, but he claims to be a Catholic, devoted Catholic. He claims that, for example, if you don't support death penalty, you cannot be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
He said that explicitly, and he said that he's a polygamist all the time. So, and he, in his discourse, he usually appeals to Margaret Thatcher, and he repeats the same claim that you said, that she regretted at the end of her life that everybody should get a lot of money and then they can give it to charity. So I'm wondering how people who follow Margaret Thatcher, her thought, how much do they know and do they refer to this claim that, is that like a popular knowledge? Because this is the first time I heard that she disclaimed that. At the end, she regretted that claim, that charities don't work and it won't change anything, that we need some kind of socialism. Yes?
She didn't quite say, she didn't go that, she didn't quite go to the we need some kind of socialism. She said that the charitable network, charitable sort of safety net didn't work. She was thinking of
because he's all the time repeating that claim, that if we get to the free market point, the charity will work. He's so sure about that. And I think that maybe...
It's not that well known now, I don't think, because Frank Field had to say it after she died. I think it was possibly in his speech just after she died in Parliament, that he was quite friendly with her. He said that this was her biggest regret. He spoke to her not long before she died. A few people have implied it, the kind of historians of Thatcher have suggested that she must have known her father would have been horrified about things like Sunday trading or something like this. But in one sense, she was never going to disclaim that. She's not the kind of politician with which she was wrong very often. This isn't a well-known claim, I don't think. And it was, as I said, it was a private conversation between one MP to another, or one former MP to another. So, Yeah, but that backs up your point, which is, I mean, the rhetoric of the charity and so on will provide a safety net for the poor because rich are altruistic and so on, that's what she's left behind as a whole publicly available stuff. You know, you can find this stuff very, very easily.
Maybe one more? Well then, I'd like to introduce Head of School Mo Blacken, Dr. Mo Blacken, to give the word of thanks.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing I must say is to apologise for Francis not being here, our Vice-Chancellor, who is paddling palms for St Mary's in China at the moment. But I know that he would very much have wanted to be here, and I think would have been firing many questions at you. If I recall your interview with us when you came, and I remember just sitting back at one point and watching you and Francis just, it was like, this is really interesting. I just said, what? It was extremely engaging. The adage, of course, is that one should never talk about religion and politics, and you've just chosen to do both all the time. That's foolhardy, you're extremely wise. But I was just taking threads from what you were saying. I was struck by Jeffrey Archer, as most people often are. And the J word seems as the Judas. And I just thought, isn't that interesting? Because I think really, in this art of arts, he would see himself as Jesus. With our lovely Jeffrey. So that made me think about him. And then I thought, of course, because you mentioned Engelbert Humperdinck, and of course, you know, Please Release Me, yes, which was probably the great song. And it made me think of another song. This is me growing up in a very Irish Catholic household, was The Deck of Cards. You were talking about different kinds of Bibles. Do you know the song about The Deck of Cards? It's a monologue song. Oh, so you must, The Deck of Cards, which is a soldier who's caught playing cards, and he's taken up before the beef to be, you know, to be drummed out of the army. And he says that, you know, and it's, apologies for the accent, you know, my cards and my Bible. And he goes through the cards as his Bible. So maybe that's something that, you know, you could add in at some point. I thought that was quite entertaining. I've got a song theme coming through, you can tell. The other thing was, of course, Blame It on the South. And of course, I just thought Blame It on the Boogie, because that's obviously what you were doing. So there's a theme coming through here. What I loved, and what all of those silly little things that pop into my head as you talk, they all represent certain things, because of course what Jeffrey Archer doesn't have is humility. And as scholars, one must always have humility, otherwise we have nothing to learn. So I sit here thinking, golly, that's extra, oh God, I never thought of that, wow, that's, oh God. And also your erudition in that, it is what you do. You stand, you talk very lucidly and in a very informed way about your discipline. And through that you share a certain passion with us, which is extremely engaging. I suppose my final thought, I was thinking of the phrase, which you constantly mentioned, which was like, just like Jesus. And then thinking about a segue through to that. Of course, Jesus was a great teacher. And I think you would have encapsulated that this evening. Not only looking through the extremely engaging, and I want to read chapters of your book, but just in the manner in which you inhabit your learning and have the capacity to share it with others. And on that point, I will say thank you so much for allowing us to be part of that. Thank you very much for me, listening as well to the questions from colleagues and students here, and friends of yours, which make me realise exactly how much I don't know, but it's always a very good reminder for anybody that's in education. And so just like Jesus, I would say, drink wine, not like breaking bread, but dip a carrot stick in a bit of this, and enjoy. Thank you so much, everybody here, for coming, but thank you so much, James, for just such an engaging and accessible presentation for those of us who don't live in your discipline, but would very much like to paddle palms with it now. Thank you.